Fate's gavel doesn't always fall in a courtroom. Sometimes it falls on a kitchen table in a hillside mansion, and the sound is quieter than a gunshot. Yet the wound it leaves never quite heals.
Here, she's yours,
said Margaret Winters, counting the bills with fingers trembling from pleasure. Across the kitchen, still smelling of last night's dinner she hadn't cooked, stood a 22-year-old woman named Claire. She wasn't looking at the money. She was looking at the man she had just been handed to. A worn jacket, scuffed boots, and a face that carried the exhaustion of the street more clearly than any words could. $100. That was exactly what, in the eyes of the woman Claire once called mother, a stepdaughter was worth. A girl who had scrubbed the floors of a house, built with her own father's money for 3 straight years. Daisy, the stepsister, snorted with laughter somewhere behind her, hiding her mouth behind a hand with a perfect French manicure. Margaret smiled so widely it looked as if she'd just gotten rid of a stain on the hardwood floor, rather than a human being. She didn't even bother to meet Claire's eyes as the girl silently picked up the single suitcase that had already been packed, without her knowledge, without her consent, as if the decision to cast her out had been made long before that morning. And none of them, not the satisfied widow, not the laughing daughter, had any idea that the man they contemptuously called the beggar from the market would in just 8 months turn their comfortable, self-satisfied lives completely upside down. None of them knew his real name. None of them could have imagined they would one day see this face on the front page of every business publication in the country, right next to the word chairman. Before we go any further, ask yourself one honest question. If your own family sold you for $100, would you ever be able to forgive them? Hold on to that question. By the end of the story, the answer might not be as simple as it seems right now. For now, let's go back 6 months before that morning. Back to the moment when the price of a human life turned out to equal the price of a modest dinner at a restaurant. 6 months before that morning, Claire Winters was already dead. Nobody had simply bothered to tell her. She woke at 5 every morning, while the mansion still slept. And by 7, fresh coffee was already on the table, and the floors gleamed, as if no one had ever actually lived there. Officially, she remained the daughter of Richard Winters, a man whose name had once graced the facades of half the office towers in Seoul, a man who had built his empire from nothing, and died far too soon to see what would become of his house. In reality, after his death, she'd become an unpaid maid, in a home that legally belonged half to her. Every morning followed the same script. She ironed shirts she would never wear herself. She served breakfast to people who wouldn't look up from their plates unless they needed someone to yell at. A broken cup, a forgotten phone call, a vase moved an inch out of place. Any small thing became a reason for humiliation, and Claire had long since stopped treating those reprimands as something worth arguing against. She simply nodded, apologized, and went back to work. Psychologist Rebecca Mandeville, author of the well-known study on family scapegoating, her book Rejected, Shamed, and Blamed, describes a mechanism in which one family member is unconsciously assigned responsibility for the entire system's dysfunction, allowing everyone else to preserve the illusion of their own blamelessness. In her research, the scapegoat role most often falls to whoever is the most honest and vulnerable member of the family, precisely because that vulnerability is the easiest to exploit. Margaret didn't need to prove anything, either to herself or to Daisy. As long as Claire existed, she was always the one at fault, which let Margaret go, on seeing herself as a devoted mother forced to endure an ungrateful stepdaughter. The one thing that kept Claire from dissolving entirely into that role was a small photograph tucked in her apron pocket. Her father, laughing, alive, real, taken somewhere on the coast long before illness took him far too early. "You would have known what to do," she would whisper to him in the evenings, when no one could see, tracing his face with her finger as if trying to hold on to warmth she'd nearly forgotten. There were other details Claire had learned not to notice, because noticing them hurt too much. How quickly her father's belongings vanished from the house. First his favorite armchair, then his library, then the photographs on the walls. as if Margaret were methodically erasing every trace of the man whose name had once kept this entire household afloat. How Daisy once joked about renting Claire out to acquaintances who needed free help around the house. And how no one in the room even smiled at the awkwardness of that joke, because everyone understood there was more truth in it than anyone cared to admit. Some nights Claire allowed herself to imagine what this house would have been like if her father had lived. She pictured Sunday breakfasts, where nobody counted the minutes of her being late. She pictured conversations without the fear of saying the wrong thing. But morning always dragged her back to a reality where such dreams were an unaffordable luxury for someone in her position. On the morning she was called out to the yard, she didn't yet know that. Margaret had spent several days quietly negotiating with a man the whole neighborhood considered a beggar. In the evenings, while Claire washed dishes in the kitchen, suspecting nothing. She didn't know her things had already been packed into a single worn suitcase by her stepmother's own hand. The first time in 3 years Margaret had touched anything belonging to her stepdaughter. Not to scold her, but to get rid of her for good. She didn't know that within the hour she would have. No home, no last name, no choice left at all. She simply wiped her hands on her apron and walked out toward the day. Voice calling her, for the last time, as if she still belonged.
This is her,
Margaret said, and there wasn't a trace of maternal warmth in those 3 words. Only the relief of a seller finally closing a deal that had grown tiresome in its delay. The man at the gate said nothing. He looked at Claire as if he were weighing something invisible, something that couldn't be seen but could be felt in an instant. Then he silently handed over an envelope of cash. Margaret counted the bills, faster than most people say, "Thank you," licking her lips in anticipation. Why? Was all Claire could manage once they were walking down the street, the mansion shrinking behind them like a set piece from someone else's life that no longer had anything to do with her. The man didn't answer right away. When he finally spoke, his voice was level, without a trace of superiority.
because you needed somewhere to go.
That wasn't the kind of sentence spoken by a man who'd just bought another human being. It was the sentence of someone who, it seemed, understood the price of having nowhere to go, better than he understood the price of money. Claire studied him out of the corner of her eye. Worn-out boots, a faded jacket with frayed cuffs, but a posture that was straight, almost oddly dignified for someone living on the street. His hands were rough but clean. His eyes were tired but alert, as if he noticed everything around him and missed nothing. Something about that contrast caught her attention and refused to let go. They walked in silence for a long while, down narrow streets sloping toward the river, past the lit windows of strangers' homes where, judging by the sounds, ordinary families were having dinner. Nothing at all like the one Claire had just left behind. Eventually they reached a small house on the outskirts, not luxurious but clean, kept up with a kind of quiet discipline that suggested someone maintained it carefully despite the poverty surrounding it. In the yard stood a couple of old chairs, a bicycle with a rusted chain, and neatly folded blankets, as if the owner had made a habit of treating even the little he had with care. "You can leave if you want," he said at the end. Gate, looking directly at her for the first time. "I didn't bring you here to keep you prisoner. I brought you here because you needed somewhere to go." The words hung in the air. Claire glanced back at the open gate behind her. Technically, she was free. But freedom meant nothing when there was nowhere left to return to.
I'll stay,
she said finally. He nodded silently and opened the door. Claire stood on the threshold of a freedom that was worthless without a single place to belong to. And in that moment, she had no idea that the man who called himself simply June was carrying a secret that would change not only her life, but the future of an entire corporation employing thousands of people. Claire spent her first night in the stranger's house wide awake. Not out of fear, but out of confusion at a kindness she had forgotten how to recognize. The room was small, furnished with old but tidy furniture that had clearly served more than one generation of tenants. There was a single bed on the floor. June, without asking a single question, gave it to Claire immediately, settling himself on a thin mat by the door like a sentry.
What about you?
She asked. "I'm used to it," came the answer, delivered so matter-of-factly there was nothing left to argue. He made dinner himself, a simple soup from the little food the house had, and set the bowl in front of her as if it were the most natural thing in the world. Not a gesture that deserved gratitude. Claire wasn't used to anyone caring for her without expecting something in return. Psychologist Erik Erikson, the father of the theory of psychosocial development, described the very first and most fundamental crisis of the human psyche. Basic trust versus basic mistrust, which forms in infancy and determines whether an adult will ever be able to trust another person without an underlying dread of betrayal. According to Erikson, when this early crisis is poorly resolved, often due to the loss of a key attachment figure, a person can spend a lifetime expecting betrayal even where none exists. In Claire's case, that trust had been burned to the ground by 3 years of humiliation following her father's death, the one person who had once been unconditionally on her side. And it was all the more remarkable to watch how, through the smallest, almost invisible gestures, a bowl of warm soup, an extra blanket, silence without a single reproach. June was, day by day, rebuilding something that had seemed irreparably destroyed. Days folded into weeks, weeks into months. Claire began noticing details that had once slipped past her. How June never raised his voice, even when something went wrong. How carefully he handled even the cheapest object, as if he valued not the price of things, but the simple fact of having them at all. How closely he listened whenever she let something slip about the home she'd lost. But alongside the warmth, a mystery settled into that house as well. Every morning, well before sunrise, June quietly disappeared. Claire would hear only the faint creak of the door through her half-sleep. Every evening he returned with the same calm, unreadable smile, as if he'd never left at all, never explaining where he'd been. Claire never asked. Something told her this silence had a reason she wasn't yet meant to know. One day, an elderly woman on the street stopped, studied his face, and murmured something like, "Is that really you?" Before June gently but firmly steered Claire away. "She mistook me for someone else," he said with a light smile that, for a second, looked strained. Claire nodded, but something inside her already knew. That wasn't the first case of mistaken identity, and it certainly wouldn't be the last. And very soon, it would turn out that the elderly woman on the street hadn't been mistaken at all. The months Claire spent in that small house on the outskirts of Seoul gave her something she hadn't felt since her father died: peace. She got a job as a waitress at a small nearby cafe. Simple work, modest pay. But every one she earned reminded her she was capable of standing on her own 2 feet without anyone's charity. The cafe's owner, an older woman named Sun Hee, quickly warmed to her new employee with an almost maternal fondness Claire hadn't experienced in so long she almost didn't trust it. Psychologist Martin Seligman, who developed the concept of learned helplessness, proved experimentally that when a person is kept for too long in conditions where their actions change nothing, they eventually stop trying at all. Not because they're incapable, but because they've lost the belief that their efforts matter. 3 years in the Winters household had taught Claire exactly that. She'd forgotten how to ask for anything, forgotten how to expect fairness, forgotten to believe her own effort meant anything at all. And that small cafe, step by step, began unteaching it. Every order taken correctly, every satisfied regular customer, became a tiny proof that the world could, sometimes, respond fairly to her effort. Author Colette Dowling, in her landmark book, The Cinderella Complex, described a hidden fear many women carried toward full independence, an unconscious hope that someone else will eventually take responsibility for their life, sparing them the need to fight alone. Claire was no exception, but with every shift she worked and paid for herself, that fear grew weaker, replaced by something sturdier, a self-respect that didn't depend on anyone's approval. Meanwhile, the feelings she'd once mistaken for simple gratitude toward June kept deepening into something far more profound and far more frightening. He never asked for anything in return for his kindness, never kept a tally, never brought up the deal struck for $100, as though that number were merely an inconvenient formality rather than any measure of her worth. In the evenings, they would talk for hours in the kitchen, about books, about food, about the city, which the two of them somehow seemed to know from entirely different, almost opposite sides. One evening, his phone rang. Claire had never seen the calm drain from his face so quickly. He stepped outside, exchanged a few clipped words, and came back a different man. Guarded, distant, almost a stranger. As if some invisible switch inside him had flipped in an instant. "There are a few things I need to take care of," he said, and without waiting for questions, disappeared into the night. He didn't come home that night. Or the next. And once Claire's worry finally overtook her hope, she did something she'd never done before. She went looking for answers herself. Her only lead was the number that had called that evening. Claire had caught a few of the digits that flashed on his screen as he rushed out the door. She dialed it with trembling fingers, expecting to hear almost anything except the calm, polite voice of a secretary who read out the address of one of the city's largest corporate towers. She'd expected a modest office, maybe some temporary job June was too embarrassed to mention. Instead, a 42-story glass headquarters rose in front of her, the home of the Orem Group conglomerate. A monolith of glass with a row of luxury sedans lined up at its base, employees hurrying through the revolving doors with the nervous urgency of people who move quickly only near real power. Claire froze at the entrance, feeling absurd in her plain sweater among tailored suits and heels that likely cost more than she earned in half a year at the cafe. Then a wave of near-synchronous bows swept through the lobby. Secretaries, security guards, random visitors, all lowering their heads as if on cue.
Welcome back, Chairman Lee,
someone said behind her. Claire turned toward the doors. A black sedan pulled up outside. The door opened. June stepped out. Except this wasn't the man in the worn jacket she knew. A perfectly tailored suit, a confident posture, the gaze of a man used to the world stopping the moment he walked in. He nodded at the greetings with polished, almost mechanical courtesy, crossing the lobby as though he'd done it 1,000 times before. In that instant, Claire's entire picture of the world shattered and rebuilt itself in a completely different order. The man who had bought her for $100, who slept on the floor so she could have the bed, who'd cooked her dinner from the last of his groceries, was Lee Jun-ho, one of the wealthiest and most powerful businessmen in all of South Korea. A name she'd seen on the covers of magazines sitting in waiting rooms she'd never once had reason to visit. She stood frozen until he spotted her in the crowd. For a second, something flickered across his usually unreadable face. Embarrassment. Maybe relief. He walked over and stopped directly in front of her, for the first time in months, making no attempt to hide behind anyone else's face. "You never knew I was Chairman Lee," he said quietly, while the employees around them pretended to be busy, sneaking curious glances. "You only knew June, the man who shared his dinner with you." Claire felt tears rising in her throat. From shock, from disorientation, from the sheer scale of the deception she'd been living inside without ever suspecting it. But beneath that revelation lay another question, one whose answer was about to change everything she thought. She knew about him. Why would a man who had everything pretend to have nothing at all? The answer Claire received that evening, in his apartment on the top floor, spacious, minimalist, free of any showy luxury, turned out to be far more honest and far more painful than she expected. "For years, people only saw the money," June said, staring out at the lights of nighttime Seoul spread beneath them like an endless net of glowing points. "My name, my influence, what I could give them. Women introduced to me as potential wives, investors who suddenly became my closest friends. At some point, I stopped being able to tell who was standing next to me for me, and who was there for my name. It's more exhausting than any negotiation." Psychologist John Gray, in his well-known book Men Are From Mars, Women Are From Venus, describes a phenomenon he calls going into the cave. A. Man's need to fully withdraw from his usual social role in order to regain inner clarity and rediscover what he actually wants, rather than what everyone around him expects of him. Gray notes that for most men, this cave is simply a garage, a gym, or a few hours of silence after a hard day. For Lee Jun-ho, it became an entire year of life without a name, without money, without a single privilege, because only in a place where he had nothing left to offer could he finally discover who would choose him, rather than what he owned. My grandfather once asked me who would be standing beside me once all of this is gone, he continued, nodding toward the skyline outside the window. I couldn't answer him. I had a list of suitable candidates my own assistants had put together, and not one of them felt real. And then I remembered. You, even before that day at the mansion gate. You, working at that cafe. Honest, even with strangers who owed you nothing. Claire remembered the strange way he'd looked at her the day of the deal. It made sense now. He hadn't been buying her like merchandise. He'd been searching for the one person capable of seeing him without the mask, long before he'd worked up the courage to speak to her. You never knew I could give you more than a roof over your head, he said quietly. You chose to stay beside me when I had nothing to offer but myself. This wasn't a test. It was the only honest experiment I've run in years. Claire listened, and something inside her shifted. Not admiration for his wealth, but something quieter and truer. The understanding that the kindness he'd shown her hadn't been. The mask of a successful man playing at charity. It had been real. Long before she ever knew the word chairman belonged to him. Months later, they married. Quietly, almost without press, among a small circle of close people, which, to Claire's surprise, included Sun Hee from the cafe. But the world Lee Jun-ho lived in didn't know how to keep secrets for long. And very soon, a headline would appear across every business publication in the country. One that would forever upend the fragile balance two people had only just begun to build trust upon. The lights of the red carpet at the Orem Group's annual charity gala blazed to life the moment the limousine pulled up. Reporters shouted Junho's name from every direction, but the cameras wouldn't let go of the woman beside him either. The same face nobody in the country had recognized just months earlier. Claire stayed close to her husband with the poise of someone used to attention, even though inside she was still tight with nerves. She answered reporters' questions briefly and calmly, making no attempt to be anyone other than herself. And it was that very naturalness, against all expectation, that won the public over far more than any rehearsed answer could have. Thousands of miles away, in the living room of the mansion on the hill, Margaret Winters was holding a cup of cold tea when the news anchor announced, Chairman Lee Jun-ho arrived tonight with his wife, Claire Lee. The camera lingered on the couple walking the red carpet under a storm of flashing lights. The cup slipped from Margaret's hands and shattered against the floor. Psychologist Leon Festinger, who developed the theory of social comparison, explained that people measure their own worth not in absolute terms, but always relative to those around them, which is exactly why someone else's sudden success can trigger not joy, but a sharp, almost physical sense of losing one's own status, even when that success takes nothing real away from the observer. Margaret felt no remorse at all for having once sold her stepdaughter for $100. She felt only one thing, far more corrosive, that she had thrown away with her own two hands. Something that turned out to be priceless. And the entire country was now watching that mistake unfold live. Daisy stared silently at the screen, unable, for the first time in a long while, to find anything funny to say. Her own life, an endless string of parties paid for with her mother's money, no purpose to speak of, suddenly looked small and hollow next to what the girl she'd spent years mocking had achieved. Neighbors who had watched the Winters mansion from a distance for years without ever caring much about its residents suddenly began stopping by the fence, whispering, pointing at the house where, according to the rumors, a future billionaire's wife had once been kept like a servant. Margaret, who had always prized her reputation as the perfect hostess above nearly everything else, felt for the first time in her life what it was like to be the subject of judgment, rather than its source. The next morning, a taxi pulled up outside the gates of Lee Jun-ho's estate, and two women stepped out in carefully chosen outfits, wearing smiles neither of them had ever once given Claire, not even by accident.
Claire, darling, we've missed you so much.
Margaret said the moment she saw her stepdaughter, at the door of a mansion she herself had never once been a guest in. Claire looked silently at the woman whose face had once dictated the shape of every single day of her life. Not so long ago, she would have believed every word, would have been overjoyed at the visit, would have tried to earn even a scrap of the love she'd been denied her whole life. Now she saw only a carefully rehearsed performance, and was surprised to find it no longer touched her at all. "We made a mistake. We're still your family. Come home." Margaret reached for her hand, her voice cracking with an almost convincing sincerity. Claire gently pulled away. "My home is already here." Margaret faltered for a moment, as if she hadn't expected to be refused, as if she'd been certain a few warm words could erase years of humiliation as easily as she herself had erased the memory of them. Daisy, standing a step behind, failed for the first time in their entire shared history to find a single joke to fill the awkward silence. Psychologist Robert Enright, one of the foremost researchers on the psychology of forgiveness and founder of the International Forgiveness Institute, draws a critical distinction between two very different processes. Reconciliation, restoration of a relationship with the person who caused harm, and forgiveness, an internal release from anger that carries no obligation to ever let that person back into one's life. According to his research, many people mistakenly treat these two ideas as inseparable, and as a result either remain trapped in toxic relationships for the sake of appearing forgiving, or spend years carrying their anger, afraid that letting go of it is the same as surrender. That distinction was one Claire understood intuitively, better than any textbook could have taught her. She could release the pain without reopening the door to the house where it had been born. "The day you sold me for $100, you stopped being my family," she said calmly, without a trace of a tremor in her voice, looking directly into the eyes of the woman who had once terrified her with a single glance. "Not because I'm angry, because it's true." The silence that followed said more than any apology ever could have. Psychiatrist Judith Herman, in her landmark work, Trauma and Recovery, writes that genuine healing after prolonged abuse, whether physical or emotional, begins not with forgiving the person who caused it, but with rebuilding one's own sense of safety and control over one's own life. Only once that sense of control is regained can a person truly decide the terms, or whether at all, on which to let the abuser back in. Claire had found both, not because of her husband's wealth, but because, for the first time in years, someone had given her a voice instead of the right only to stay silent. Margaret left empty-handed, leaving behind nothing but the scent of expensive perfume and accusations that went unspoken. Claire watched the taxi pull away and felt, not triumph, but an unexpected relief. The very kind every researcher of forgiveness describes. Freedom not from the person who hurt her, but from the need to keep earning their love. The trial she had just passed mattered far more than any wedding or headline. It had been a test of whether she would finally choose herself. A year later, Claire stood on the very spot where she'd once first crossed the threshold of that small house on the outskirts of the city. Except the house was long gone now, replaced by a charity center for women who had survived family abuse, named in her honor. The center opened quietly, without any fanfare, exactly as Claire had wanted. Its first residents were women whose stories echoed her own in ways that startled her. Years of invisible labor in other people's homes. A trust they'd forgotten how to feel. A fear that their effort would never matter to anyone. Psychologists Richard Tedeschi and Lawrence Calhoun, who developed the concept of post-traumatic growth, proved something that had rarely been taken seriously in psychology before them. The most devastating experiences don't only break a person. They can also become fertile ground for deep, lasting change, a reordering of priorities, a strengthening of inner resolve, and a new capacity for closeness that had never existed before the trauma. Their research is clear that this kind of growth never comes from the trauma itself. It comes from how a person processes and makes meaning of it afterward. Claire's story was exactly that case. The pain her own family had caused her hadn't broken her for good. It had become the foundation on which she'd built something real. First trust in one person, And then the ability to help hundreds of others who had once known that same loneliness. Among the guests at the opening ceremony was Sun-hee, the same cafe owner who had given Claire her first job and her first proof that honest work could actually change something. She stood in the front row with a pride few mothers ever show their own daughters, quietly wiping away tears as Claire delivered a short speech of thanks that never once mentioned her husband's wealth or her own status. Only a simple idea that every person deserves a second chance, even if their own family once decided they didn't. Junho, now simply a husband rather than a chairman of the board, stood beside her, watching her cut the ribbon at the center's opening amid the applause of dozens of people whose lives she'd promised to change the same way hers had once been changed. "You saved me too, you know," he said quietly, taking her hand.
I just accepted help nobody was obligated to offer me, she answered with a faint smile.
"No." He shook his head. "You did more than that. You taught me that kindness isn't weakness. It's the only debt money can never repay." Claire Winters' story began with a sum of $100, paid to get rid of her. It ended with a sum that can't be counted at all. The sum of lives changed by her own decision, made once, to refuse to break. Now ask yourself, honestly, if you'd once been sold for $100 by the people you called family, would you have found it in yourself to forgive? Or, like Claire, would you simply let go and walk forward? Leave your answer and the city you're watching from in the comments below. I'd genuinely love to hear from you.